Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Apex Podcast. As always, I am your host, Jan Almasy, and today I am joined by my co-host and partner in crime on another segment of the show that you might recognize, the Disruptor, Mr. John Kuntz. John, how's it going, brother?
I'm great, buddy. How are you?
Fantastic. I am so excited for this episode today. It's going to be a little bit different for everybody listening. This is kind of an episode that we are going to take our standard kind of mantra a little bit off track. It's still going to be ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things, but me and John both have a little bit of personal investment in this episode because for those of you that don't know, I'm Slovak and John is something over there in that same area. And we'll explore that a little bit more as we get into the episode. That
we'll enlighten a little bit on what we are, mine and David's ethnic confusion, as we like to call it.
That'll make a lot more sense as the episode progresses. But, you know, as John just said there, we have a third person here with us, for those of you that are listening, by the name of David. And John, I would love to allow you to make that introduction since he is your family.
So our guest today, and actually we were prepping for another interview on the Disruptor theme, and we decided to have a little segment or segue into our family history. And so on the phone is my uncle, my dad's brother, David Kundtz, who is in his own right I will say an ordinary person who does extraordinary things. He's written a number of books. He's run a very successful practice, family practice and counseling practice, and you also happen to be my godfather, David. So it's sort of this part of what we want to do today is sort of capture some of this knowledge of our family history on really the one gentleman, my great-grandfather and David's grandfather, Theodore Kuntz, who really wasn't sort of an ordinary person who accomplished extraordinary things. So, David, why don't you give a little better introduction of yourself and your background, and then I'll tell a little story on sort of how we brought you into this picture.
Great, John. Great to be with both of you. I'm from Cleveland originally and went out west in the 1960s as a Catholic priest and spent 20 years in the Diocese of Idaho serving as a priest, and then a couple of years of that also in South America in Cali, Colombia. Came back, then shortly after that left ministry, got retrained out here in California in Berkeley at the Graduate Theological Union and began a private practice as a family psychotherapist. Did that for 20 years. In the meantime, wrote several books, as John mentioned, in the areas of popular psychology and spirituality. And I am now retired, and the focus of our conversation today is the place of origin of my grandfather and John's great-grandfather, Theodore Kuntz, which is Medzev, Slovakia, or historically Mecenzéfen. Recently, I was looking at the website of Metzenseifen's website, and I realized from the time the town was founded, like in the it was the late 13th century, there are dozens of names for this place. And every one is a little bit different, but you can find a family resemblance in all the names. And the most current one, of course, is Medzev, Slovakia, which leads, of course, John, into our family confusion. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, so it's funny because we that's why we're calling this sort of ethnic confusion. So actually, I'm going to throw up a little picture. I gave a presentation a while back called why can't I find the city where my family is from? And it sort of starts before World War One, when it was still when my great grandfather, David's grandfather, emigrated to the United States. And this is the best map I could find for those that are watching it, and we'll try to describe it for those that are listening. But I guess, from what I could tell, David, we were part of or it was the region was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And as it was explained to me, probably by either you or somebody else, or that the sort of the Germans came over the Carpathian Mountains and settled in what was we always learned was Mecenzéfen, and therefore they spoke German, but sort of were technically Hungarian because of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at the time. And from you can see it, if it's only um, the reason Jan and I got speaking is he was at one point, I think, John, you were on you were traveling to Toronto, and we were talking on the phone, and you were going across the border. This is back before things shut down, and said you were headed to, and I always going to mispronounce because my Slovakian is not very good, or Slovak. Koshi, is that how you say it? Košice. I'll get it. Yeah. It just takes me a while. So you were headed there. I looked on a map and I go, holy cow, Košice is only like 35 kilometers from Metzenseifen. And so that's how we sort of got this whole thing going. And then I started looking around later about a modern day map. And now I'm starting to realize, okay, yeah, so we are part of the Slovak Republic. And you got Poland to the north and Hungary to the south and Austria and the Czech Republic over to the east and Russia and Ukraine over to, excuse me, Czech Republic and Australia to the west and the Ukraine and Russia to the east. So it's sort of how we I guess I've been trying to resolve this ethnic confusion for the uh, the last few years. So it's a bit of a little history map there. But David, you were one of the last. Actually, I think you certainly are the only one, maybe the only one in your generation. And I don't believe anybody in my generation has actually traveled to Medzev. And I know you did, and that's part of why I wanted to, capture some of that recollection. Um, if
That was, and we also have a connection, Jan, to Košice. Um, and I might just mention that quickly. And that is my uncle Theodore, who was my grandfather Theodore's oldest surviving child. So my uncle Ted, we called him. He went to school in Košice, and I looked up the school. It was something like the Kershaw Academy, and I couldn't find any reference to it. But he was sent there from Lakewood, Ohio, to Košice to go to I think it was high school. I think it was a Catholic boys' high school, and he went there with Father William Kuntz, who was Theodore's cousin, I believe, and he eventually left the priesthood, married, and had a couple of kids whom my older relatives have been in touch with. So anyway, that's a slight but interesting connection to Košice. Yeah, okay. My partner Bob and I went to the visit Austro-Hungarian Empire and Slovakia in 2008. Let me give you a little background how we got there. Um, there's a man by the name of Heinz Schlösner who lives in um Berlin, and he is the administrator and the operator of the Metzenseifen website. And he put me in touch with Karol and Valeria Flakbart. Now, Valeria Flakbartova, I think they say, is the mayor, was the mayor, I think still is the mayor of Medzev. And Karol is a professor he's a scientist. He studies temperatures and some very esoteric kind of science in Košice.
he's a serious physicist. I looked him up this morning, trying to see if I could get some background out of. And yeah, and I'm a scientist by training, and what he was publishing in what I read today was like right over my head. So yeah, he seems a fairly smart person.
but wonderful people, and they gave Bob and me this wonderful tour of Metzenseifen. And we felt, we figured we'd go there, rent a car, and drive around and look and see if we could find a gravesite or something. But with this introduction through Hans Schlussner and Karol Flakbart and Valeria Flakbartova, who was the mayor, we were treated like royalty, like the favorite son's relative. So we were given lunch and a tour of the mayor's office, and the brought to the hammers, which are the traditional industry of Metzenseifen, and just treated just wonderfully. So it was a really, really magnificent experience. And I finally resolved our ethnic confusion, John. When Theodore came to this country in 1852, I believe he told most people when asked that he was German. And that was because he had this intense identity with the Germans all the way, I believe, from the 13th century. It was founded by Germans, and they kept that ethnic identity very, very, very strongly. So he said that he was German. I believe that's what he did. Of course, I don't know. He died the year I was born, so I didn't know him. Um, but I got that information through my father. We're German. No, we're not German. The name's German. The founding fathers of the town in the 13th century were German, and many immigrants who came since were German. But we're Slovak. We're Slovakian. Had he a passport today, it would be a Slovakian passport. So I proudly say I'm Slovak Hungarian. I think you have to include the Hungarian because of that background of the empire there. So the ethnic confusion is understandable, but now I think resolved. I think we get it. And it's also, what I've also found is that many people who trace their roots back to this area have the same problem.
I was going to say something
It
that's
isn't
really
unique
interesting
to.
about the way that you're explaining that is like in modern day, when I was looking into Medzev and how to describe it geographically in the modern context, what's really cool is that it's actually so I mean Slovakia is divided up into regions, right? And we explained a
Mhm.
little bit before the microphone came on that my cousin Josef Yarab is actually the bishop of the Spiš region at Košice or at Spiška Kapitula. And then Medzev, if you look at it in the context of the way they have that split up, it's actually a part of the region of Košice, and then it's listed, I
Oh,
think, as its postal area is Košice na Okoli, which means essentially on the outskirts of Košice.
okay.
So there's
Okay.
like
Yes.
um there's the actual Košice, the city, and then there's Sadi na Torisu, which is where Zdoba and Bister and all of my mom's villages are located. And then there's Košice na Okoli, which is like the outermost circle of that area, and Medzev fits right inside of Košice na Okoli.
Is in there. Okay.
Hmm.
That's cool.
Yeah, so we're both still apart. You guys are a little bit further out of the concentric circles, but we're all still a part of the same county essentially.
Well, when we visited, we went. They brought us into the church there, which is, I forget the name of the church, but as we walked into the church, over the high altar, there's that big baldacchino over the altar, and printed in Latin over the altar was, "This church was renovated in 1931 by Theodore Kuntz." So there was no doubt about that. Everyone who went to mass there every day saw his name. And so it became very, very clear to us that he was one of their celebrated. Yeah, there's the church. Yeah, in the foothills of the Carpathians. Yeah, beautiful little church.
Yes, I say that's Mary Queen of Angels Church, and it's pretty much you can see it. It's up here in this upper for those watching, and it's way up. It's always in. It's very tall. It's probably the tallest building in the village, and it.
Like cities is that the church steeple is one of the highest. Fun fact: Spiš is actually one of the only areas where the church steeple isn't the highest thing in the area, and it's because when the king built Spiška hrad on top of the mountain, he had to build it on the mountain that was one step up from the monastery. So Spiš, the region, is one of the only ones where the castle is actually higher than the church steeple.
Yeah, yeah, that would be rare. One of the enjoyments we had from our trip to this area was in Budapest. My grandfather was part of a group of citizens, I think maybe international group of citizens, to erect a statue of George Washington in Budapest. And so we were told that it was in a park in Budapest, and that's all we knew. So we went into Városliget. I'm not sure I'm saying that. It's a great huge park in the middle of Budapest, and searched for it for several hours until we finally found the statue of George Washington, and there it was, big as life. And my grandfather, one of the things when I say that he said that he was German, he was also very, very dedicated to Hungarian causes. In fact, he helped build the Hungarian Center in Cleveland, and he helped erect the statue of George Washington in Budapest. So he also identified as Hungarian, but the language was always German. My father spoke a little German, but he didn't have a word of Hungarian. Um, that was the strength of that German identity. No, no, not at all. But we had some identity.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, and if you run into people in Cleveland today and they recognize our last name, 90 the ones that do are almost are 100% of call themselves Hungarian descendants, and it's actually one of the reasons there's such a big Hungarian population in the city of Cleveland is because Theodore was looking for workers, and he helped bring people over to work in his factory. He was a cabinet maker and made sewing machines, cabinets, and bicycle rims, and church furniture, and school furniture, and yeah, and at one point even made automobile bodies when they were made out of wood, which actually leads me into an interesting question, David, and that you may have. Not, I don't know if you've contemplated it, but Medzev or Mecenzéfen is not known for cabinet makers. It's known more for blacksmiths, for lack of a better word, right? I mean, metal workers and iron workers. Yeah, they're the iron workers and the
They took us to the hammers. We made a visit to the hammers, and the man who runs the hammers came out and put them into operation for us. This was the extent they went to be welcoming to us. And yes, so I was also having the same question, John, that you had. Why wasn't our grandfather or great grandfather? Why wasn't he in the metallurgy business? Why was he? Well, on the website, it also says that there was a workshop run by a man by the name of Tischler, who did wood joining and carpentry. So I'm convinced that our ancestors must have learned carpentry from them. But that was definitely the second most important industry in Metzenseifen. And they, in that website entry, it said they made coffins and they made desks and they made furniture and anything made from wood. So when Theodore came to this country, he knew wood. That's what he knew was woodworking. And of course, that's what his company went on to make, anything made of wood. All kinds of buildings in Cleveland, the courthouse. In fact, John, I don't know if you knew this, but the original Cleveland Stadium on the lakefront, all the seats in that stadium were made by the Theodore Kuntz Company. So he was very, very well trained in woodworking.
I actually have a brochure that I was able to find advertising the fact that the old municipal stadium in Cleveland, that whatever it was, 81,000 seats were all from the Theodore Kuntz Company.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. At one time, he was, I think, the largest employer in Cleveland. At one time, there's a story I have. There's a story I have about people, Hungarian people in Cleveland Make a long story short, when I was home from a summer vacation from college, my mother asked me to take a chair down to Buckeye Road to have it uh, reupholstered. So I brought the chair down, and the reupholsterer was saying, "Are you," in a very heavy accent, "are you related to Theodore Kuntz?" And I said, "Yes, he's my grandfather." Oh my God, he went on and on and on about how wonderful he was, and he worked for him, and his father worked for him. And he said, "As a memento, I'll give you this letter opener." And it was a letter opener that had the Theodore Kuntz seal on it, and I still have it and treasure it. And he said, "But please find me another letter opener." So I went out to a Woolworths drugstore and got this crummy old plastic letter opener. I was just a kid. What did I know? And so I gave it to him, and he looked at it and said, "Okay, okay, you can have it." So yeah, he was very, very well known in Cleveland at that time. In fact, his picture was on the rapid transit. You remember seeing that, John?
Yeah, there you go. So there's the letter opener, and actually there's the 62,781 seats in the old Cleveland Municipal Stadium were manufactured by Theodore's company. So yeah, these I've got a couple of these letter openers that are we've been able to dig up. It's pretty cool. But yeah,
I'm curious. So it said that he had 10 children,
He
it
did.
looked like.
Yes.
That's
One,
that's a large
several died.
family.
Yeah, very, very large family. In fact, he was originally married to Agnes, and I don't know Agnes's last name, and she was barren, and so they divorced, and he remarried his wife Maria Balash, who is also from Mecenzéf, but I don't believe Maria was born there. I think she was born in Cleveland, but from Mecenzéf. And they went on to have 10 children. The first one, Josie, died in infancy. The second one was Theodore, who was, I mentioned, went to school in Košice. And then there they are. Yeah, from Dorothy, my father Ewald, Marie, Angie, Aunt Angie, who lived out here in Carmel, Uncle Leo, my godfather, and Aunt Irene. Yeah. And when you look at those people, they're they're not German. They have this very what down to earth peasant quality to them. They're big people. They're not little Aryan blonde haired Germans at all. No, they're Slovak.
Slavs, baby. Yeah, I mean, it's funny looking at those names because, I have an Aunt Dorothy. My dad or my grandfather's sister was Aunt Irene. We have an Angie in our family. I swear on everything, man. We have the same we have even the same names.
Leo was Leopold, not anything else. And Ewald from the forest.
Mhm.
been one of the challenges in trying to put the history together because everybody kept renaming everybody the same names, and sometimes even in the same generation they would be the same names. So, um, but we actually were able to transfer our history back to into the 1700s. Um, and then, but as you can see, there's Ionis, which I understand is I don't know if that's it's a John derivative.
Ioannis is John, yeah.
Yeah.
And then our great grandfather was Michael Kunt. The name was changed when he came to this country. I don't know if it was when he came into the country or later. I'm not sure when the name was changed. But there's several spellings of that name. Often it's Kuntz, and there's many different spellings of it. So yeah, that's a good chart. One of the things we really enjoyed in our visit to Mecenzeifen was a visit to the cemetery, and so many names are just there. And we saw my great grandparents' uh, grave there, and it was really very emotional
Was the,
to
cemetery in
be in the space.
was the cemetery there, were they above ground or were they in ground?
My recollection, Jan, is that they were both. I think mostly in ground. But as I think back on that, the gravestone for my great grandparents was quite large. I remember that. It was larger than I expected it to be. I don't know why, but it was. And but I think it was both, as I recall.
Yeah, here's a quick picture from the cemetery that I was able to dig up years ago. Um, and yeah, it does look like there's some above ground and some below ground.
The only reason I ask is because in my family's in Košice, it's when somebody passes away um over there, it's a whole like the entire village gets involved because everybody's so intimately connected. It's my parents grew or my mom grew up in a town where there's maybe 30 houses, which is, good and bad. But but they would have these like ceremonies because you could walk to the church and then you can walk from the church to the cemetery. And I guess the ground specifically around that region of Košice is not very conducive to being in ground. So the entire cemetery where our family is buried is all these massive granite slabs that are above the ground and headstones that are huge and they're way bigger than I would have ever expected. It's very ornate over there compared to here.
Right. Yeah. So we had a similar experience with that. Yeah. Uh-huh. The other thing that came up for us in our visit was the presence of the Roma people in that area, and they have also always been, I think, historically a huge challenge for all of the world. But one of the things that Valeria Flakbartova initiated was a program to give employment to Roma people, which I thought was really a neat thing. And she had them, I forget exactly what the details of the industry was, but to give them work to keep them out of the trouble that they normally get into with governments and authorities. So I really admired her for trying to really do something positive about that particular challenge in the area.
Hmm. Did did they call for the Romani or the Roma people? Did they ever use the word Tsiganka or Tsigani?
Siginer. No, I remember the word Siginer from my youth, but I don't think they use. Do you remember it, John? Yeah, there's this tradition in our family. They must have been Hungarians. I don't know where they were from. Maybe they were from Mecenzéfen, but they were musicians, and I think were they Roma people, John? Were they? They were. My
I don't
father
know.
called
They were
them,
always sort of gypsies. Yeah.
and then which is not a very favorable term, I don't think, to use. But I think they were Roma people, and I think they were musicians, and they would come every Christmas and serenade our family with this this music, and it was a big deal in our family. John, you remember
I
it, do you?
remember it explicit. Oh yeah, I remember explicitly. We'd always go to our David's
Grandparents,
father and mother, my grandparents, on Christmas Eve, and every year for years, even
years,
on two different houses,
right,
these guys would show up, and they would be at four or five of them,
right,
and one would have a violin, another might have a cello, or another
and
guy
a
had a
big bass,
bass,
and a
and
big
I don't
bass,
know.
right.
And they, yeah, I remember the big bass, and they would sing, and they do a couple songs, and I believe they also went to Uncle Leo's
I think
house
they went to Leo's house
as
too. Yeah,
well,
yeah,
and whoever they
yeah,
could find. But I remember them. Yeah, and he called them
yeah.
the Siginers, which I
Saginers.
believe
So,
is that
so
maybe
Jan,
that's.
you used the word though that's a slightly different. Is it a similar root? I bet.
Yeah, Tsigani. I think with the way that it kind of came over, the way that you guys are saying it maybe is like a slightly filtered Americanized version, or it's just a conglomeration of the other, because it almost sounds like when I was a kid, my grandfather and we went to a church called Sacred Heart Parish here in Canton, Ohio, and it was all Slovak people. They all came over here. They all worked at Republic Steel. They all lived in the same neighborhood. The Slovak club was right down the street from the Polish club, and it was everything like that. And they had this group called the Slovak Singers, and we would sing Tsigani music, and it was kind of like that, like a mixture between a gypsy music and a polka, essentially.
That's the kind of music I remember. Very fast paced and rhythmic. Yeah, yeah.
Everyone's snapping and hup hup
Yeah, yeah,
hi.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it
Yeah,
was
and they
just
would dance
absolute,
around a
and
little
they
bit.
dance, it was wonderful.
It
It was a wonderful tradition.
it was cool. I remember it explicitly. It was always like, "Well, here they come," and I'm wondering if it's just none of us knew actually how to pronounce the word correctly, so that's how it sort of evolved into the Signers.
That I think it's an
Yeah,
anglicized, mispronunciation of Sagana, yeah.
it's the Hungarian, German, English translation, the Slovakian translation that didn't,
Like the blue collar side of my family, so half of them moved and were at the Republic Steel, and the other half were coal miners in West Virginia. And it sounds like that might be the part of the family is like, oh, here come the Signers, ready to roll.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. But one of the things I wanna mention, is, the wonderful reception that we received in Metzenseifen, from the Flakbarts. These are really wonderful people, and, I think that, Jan, do you know, is she still the mayor of Metzev?
I actually looked it up, in preparation for this, and she is no she I think she, was, not reelected or didn't run, but there is a new mayor, I think as of 2018, I believe.
Okay, that makes sense because
Yeah.
she was mayor for a long, long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and Carl, they were just we keep in touch every now and then by email, and recently when the Pope visited Slovakia, we had a couple emails back and forth, and they're just wonderful, wonderful people. And if anybody has a plan to visit, if any family members have a plan to visit Metzenseifen, be sure to get in touch, and I'll give you a contact for the Flockbarts. They're wonderful
Yeah, we'll
people
have
to
to
meet. Yeah,
I'm gonna flash up a picture here. Here you and Bob are in the in her office, and I did a little research on those flags behind her because I'm flags as you can see behind me. I like flags intrigue me. So obviously one is the EU flag. I'm guessing the one in the middle is the Slovak flag, and then the one on the right behind her is the town of Metzenseifen's flag.
yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, she was just a charming, and she gave me, um, I guess I'd call it a key to the city. It's just a minute. It's a spike. It's a curved spike. There's the head of it. The hammers. It came out of the hammers, and she presented it. I keep it right here on my desk. She presented it as a key to the city, and you see that in the picture there, that plate with the orange cake.
Hmm.
It's got orange going through the middle. That's very, very typical, she said, of Mecenzéfen, of Medzev. I tell you, they were so gracious. It's just hard to say. And then I also asked them, I said, with Bob and I visiting, I said, what's it like for gay people in Slovakia? And she said, oh, it's totally cool. No problem at all. Well, part of that is because they're part of the European Union. And the other thing is that I think they're probably a lot more understanding than some of the people in that area. So I think it's still a little bit iffy over there for gay folks, but certainly getting much better. I guess that's it. Yeah. Uh-huh.
It's I would think it's similar to kind of the way the US maybe lays itself out, that you get a little bit further into the Carpathian Mountains, and it goes backwards in time slightly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true all over the world, isn't it?
That is a really, really cool. That spike is awesome. I love how one thing that I've always loved about Slovak culture, and the only um I always mess with my co-founder is hardcore Italian, and I always mess with him, and I say the only people that might be able to outhost an Italian is a Slav. Um, because I mean, when you show up, you would think like when I first came back, I didn't see my grandparents for 5 or 6 years because I was in the military. And when I came back, you would have thought that the Messiah returned to Zhdoba. I mean, we came back, the neighbors were all waiting at my grandparents' house. We went down and every single house had kolachi and shots of slivovitz. And by the time I made it back to my parents or back to my grandparents' house, I had no issues falling asleep and waking up the next morning. But it was they're so it's always inspired me, especially being in business and entrepreneurship where things can be so fast paced all the time. How gracious I am to be so closely connected to a culture that is so good at grounding themselves and just being in a moment with each other. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and that's so well said, and that totally was our experience there. That's why I keep emphasizing how embracing they were, how welcoming they were. One of the other things we did when we were there was visit our relatives, Kinga and her husband Stefan. And Kinga is related to the uncle that I mentioned, Uncle William, who was a priest, then married and had kids. They live in the Buda part of Budapest, and we went there and had dinner with them, and they made us Hungarian goulash, and the kids were just wonderful, and they gave us. We walked in the door, and they had glasses and a bottle of Slivovitz. How do you say that? Is that what it is? Of Slivovitz, Slivovitz, and of course we drank it, but I don't I hate that stuff. So, but we drank it, and they were just so enthusiastic, and it was very warming, very warming. They didn't have to do that for us. They didn't know us from Adam. It couldn't have been nicer.
I had a really, really cool conversation with my grandfather when I was over there. And this may be something that I'm really curious about two questions. And so I'll use this story to kind of explain both. So my grandfather, he was a steel worker that would have to travel back and forth to Russia because he was an engineer. And so he would work in the engineering plants. But we were sitting there having a conversation the one night, bottling up some Slivovitz because he makes his at home, and I needed to bring some bottles back to the US. Otherwise, my mom would not, invite me back into the home. Um, but we had a really deep conversation about how I basically asked him, why are we such good hosts? Like, why is it so important? You're teaching me all of these things about taking care of people. You're teaching me all of these things about making sure that you have gifts, making sure that you have good liquors, making sure that you have good food. Why is that such a large piece? And he said that he could proceeded to tell me stories about how he remembered after the war that Slovakia was left completely economically crippled, and they were on the barter system. They had no currency. They had nothing. He was, if you didn't know how to make shoes, you didn't have shoes. Or if you didn't know how to, raise a chicken to trade for a piece of clothing because you didn't know how to sew, it was so he said that the whole reason why he believes that the culture is still so prominently that way and they all care about each other so much is because it's not that long ago that the only way that you survived was on relationships with your neighbors. And I a very deep appreciation. And I've always kind of taken that with me where it's maybe that's where a lot of that gratitude or that it's maybe it's not gratitude. It's like vivaciousness for life. The life just invigorates them, and that comes from this deep appreciation for your neighbors and that value that community brings. um and so that would be kind of my two-part question is one, did you kind of you obviously you've experienced that type of feeling in Medzev, but pretty much everywhere you went, would you say that that was echoed? um, and then the second half is I'm curious about because my dad is Roman Catholic and my mom is Byzantine Rite. Uh, Is there a what was the religious context of Theodore and that part of the family as they came over? Are they Catholic, Orthodox, or what did that landscape look like?
That the first part of the question is yes, I did encounter that same vivacity and just genuine welcome and appreciation based on memories of hard times. And I'm also very grateful to have grown up in a family that exhibited that and found those same values.
Yeah, I would
Religious,
concur that that value has gone through our family
it has, John,
since as
hasn't it?
long as I can remember.
Yeah,
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 multiple
yeah.
generations.
Come in, you're welcome. Have a drink, sit and
Yeah.
yeah, you know, make yourself at home. In regard to religion, they were very, very definitely Roman Catholic. Um, the family was very practicing, very believing, and my aunts and uncles, even into their old age, were very, very practicing Catholics. Of all the children, however, it's interesting. I would say my father was probably the least, the least dedicated Catholic. He was very definitely Roman Catholic, and but uh, had um, had an attitude that I've always appreciated, which was, take it too seriously. If you can get pretty severe in religion. Religion can get pretty severe. So I always appreciated the edge he gave us about that. My mother, on the other hand, was very, very. She had a heavy dose of Irish and German from her family, so she was also very, very, very Catholic. But yeah, my father probably the least gung ho, would you say, in regard to that? But they were definitely Roman Catholic and practicing. Yeah.
Well, and I noticed that growing up with all the relatives, you know, your, my grandparents, your parents, you were the few people that were allowed to go to non-Catholic schools, right? Right? You
Right.
guys were able to go to university
Exactly. We went to
school and
U.S. and yeah,
where everybody of your generation and pretty much my generation had to go to a
Catholic high
either
school.
Gilmore, Ignatius, or
Right.
somewhere, right? I mean, so
Right.
they were definitely open to sort of exploring, certainly from
Yes.
the educational
Yeah. That was my
perspective.
dad. That was my dad, much more than my mom. Yeah, for sure. Which I've always appreciated. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to. We should wrap this up. Unless you've got other questions, John or David, you have anything else that you've covered the things that I
Um,
was curious about. I really was,
okay.
you know, wanted to explore this ethnic confusion that we
Yeah.
we, we we
Okay.
can kid
I
ourselves
think I
about, and
think
I
we
think
got
we've
the
done
ethnic
that.
confusion. Yeah.
You've definitely got Jan and I putting on our bucket list. We're going over there one of these days,
Oh, I
and
hope so. And be
you've
sure to
given the
be sure to look up the
no.
connections I mentioned.
I will. We will do that. And so, and one last commercial. So this is really a part one of an interview. The part two is going to be in a few weeks, where we're going to talk to David again under the Disruptor mantra. And so a little bit of a plug for the next one. Oh, your new book, David, called "The Art of Stopping." We're going to spend some time talking about how to survive disruption through the art of stopping. So I think it'll be another great conversation in a couple of weeks.
I'm definitely looking forward to that
Okay.
conversation as well. I mean, and you
Okay.
think
Thank you
about the
both.
way that wrapping this, and the topic that we kind of ended on was this, you know, tenacity and vivaciousness towards life, and grabbing it those moments, as they fly away. Like my grandmother always used to say that, um, oh, what's the phrase? Boha vzduch nie je veľmi dlhá na zemi, which basically means that like the breath of God doesn't stay on earth for very long. That it's
Ah,
fleeting. It hits you and then it runs away. And so that it's like your job or to be aware of when it enters, and then be grateful for the fact that it's there, and just be immersed in that moment to the point where she still sets an extra plate at the table for Jesus, and we're singing Oche Nash,
really?
or we're, saying our prayers in Slovak, and there's that extra seat. But that familial bond is something that I was really, really intrigued to see if you guys both kind of reflected, because
Mhm.
that's when I was talking to my parents over the weekend, that's what we all kind of settled on, is that our favorite part
Mhm.
about being Slovak is how tightly bonded our
Yes.
family is our family. So
Yes.
it's
Yes.
amazing
Yeah.
to know, that across generations, across different regions or ethnic confusions and whatever, that region as a whole is just wholesome, to use the phrase that we used earlier, maybe a little bit peasant like people that
Mhm.
are just
Yes.
so
Yes.
deeply
Down to
appreciative
earth.
of the simple things. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm
Absolutely.
really looking forward to exploring in the book, is maybe I've read through, I believe it's a previous version that I have. Um
Yes.
but it's the one with the blue cover.
Basically the same.
And so I've
Yeah. Right.
yeah, read through that one, and I've gotten a lot of those types of mentalities kind of coming through the words of the page. Why it's so important to be able to stop. And it's been beautiful to have this conversation as a preface to this next one. So everybody that's listening, if you want, a little bit more in depth on that type of concept and these pieces that it will allow you to really kind of grab a hold of those moments and appreciate life as you're moving through, especially now with how quickly everything seems to be moving. I highly, highly recommend this next episode.
Great.
Right. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank,
and Jan,
thank you, David.
real
It's always
pleasure.
good to chat with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to meet you, Jan. Okay.